Welcome to Peak Oil News, May 9th, 2022. Lockdowns are affecting the price of oil in China. Saudi Arabian oil company Aramco is reducing its export prices to China, believing that lack of demand requires discounts by as much as $5 a barrel. And prices to Europe were also cut by around $2 per barrel. Oil prices to the United States saw no discount. Aramco's reasoning here doesn't quite suss with another story put out by oilprice.com only a few days earlier, in which PetroChina sees fuel demand on the upswing in China, as parts of Shanghai have met the standards of China's zero COVID policy and therefore are reopening or expected to. However, China's manufacturing PMI for April came in at 47.4, which was lower than expected, and Caxton manufacturing PMI reached its lowest point since March of 2020. So perhaps Aramco's decision is at least reasonable and not simply showing favoritism towards China. However, considering demand for energy is certainly ramping up in Europe and their prices were still discounted while the US's were not, does look suspicious. Our second story, rail service is getting more erratic and will likely lead to greater supply chain disruptions. Perhaps some of the worst news for the supply chain hit on Saturday, when Pilot, one of the largest fuel retailers in the nation, announced that rail suppliers were forcing them to cut inventories by as much as 50%. This includes gas, diesel, and other ancillary but often essential products such as DEF and lubricant. Ross Corthell, chair of the National Industrial Transportation League's Rail Committee, told the Surface Transportation Board, "The nation's supply chains are in a dire situation today because of this, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse, and the longer it goes on, the worse it's going to get." And while this will certainly exacerbate shortages and high prices for transportation fuel, perhaps even more concerning is the inability of rail to transport all of the coal and chlorine needed in the country. Coal, as you likely know, is still an important part of grid electrification, accounting for just over 20% of it, and chlorine is used in water purification. Clearly, both items are base-level inputs for our economic system, and so the knock-ons will be greatly magnified. Union Pacific is forcing these limitations because its transportation ability has been hampered by the workforce limitations arising from the pandemic layoffs and likely federal stimulus, which has increased demand for its services. The convergence of more demand and less supply in the shipping sector has caused congestion to reach critical levels, and Union Pacific apparently feels the only way to clear up what has become a cluster is to limit the input activity until the system catches up. Labor unions involved in the situation have blamed worker resignation and burnout on the policies implemented during the pandemic that limited workers' access to vacation and sick days and also heavily encouraged overtime. Union Pacific officials stated they believe the situation would take at least 6 months to resolve. One thing that jumped out at me in this story is the potential for complexity collapse. In other words, it looks like a recipe for a train wreck, literally, and that certainly won't ease the problem. And to continue on with problems of power, growing numbers of states face blackouts, and it looks like grid operators in various states are beginning to see the writing is on the wall for this summer, as various agencies have come out warning about potential power outages this summer. California warned on Friday that unless it could find a way to generate more electricity than it is now, blackouts would almost be assured. Also, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, a nonprofit which provides power for 15 states, issued a warning about outages over the summer. And as stated in an earlier story from last week, Texas also looks to be facing shortages. If we get record-breaking temperatures, this would obviously increase the strain. Sorry for the lack of visuals on this episode. I am traveling and actually in El Salvador at the moment, so the next few episodes will likely be a bit austere. But hey, austerity is something we are all going to have to get used to.